Hi friends, I'm Red Stegall. I'm an entertainer, author, and proud Texas rancher. I'm inviting my fellow cattle ranchers to join me in the Alamo statewide stampede, a simple way to help preserve our Texas heritage. When you sell your livestock, just let the auction house know you'd like some or all of the proceeds to go to the Remember the Alamo Foundation. If you don't have livestock, no problem. You can still take part by making a donation. These tax-deductible donations will go directly to the Alamo Plan, which is preserving the Alamo for generations to come. And together we'll ensure we always remember the Alamo.
Stories bigger than Texas, the Alamo podcast. This week, the world celebrated Cinco de Mayo, a holiday that's gained notoriety throughout the years with theme parties and restaurant specials. But what really happened on that fateful May 5th? Today, we reveal the origins of Cinco de Mayo and how our story here at the Alamo intersects with the historical path that led to this day. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. Today, we're joined by Dr. Bruce Winders, the Alamo's former curator. Thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
We've all heard of Cinco de Mayo, and I think it's fair to say most people probably don't know Cinco de Mayo of what year? Why do we even celebrate it?
Well, that's one of the things about history is that we have celebrations, and sometimes we don't really know why we're celebrating. And Cinco de Mayo is one of those things that it's not from American history, but it's from the history of Mexico. But it's tied into the larger story. And that's why I think it's important that we understand, well, what are we really talking about?
We are talking about May 5th, 1862, but its roots go back 40 years before that.
One of the things that we often talk about here at the Alamo is that all history is connected. And what we are taught is that something happens, there's a beginning, there's an end, and then you go on to something else. And it's, well, how things are connected, which is where you begin to understand, oh, this is how you understand history, not as isolated points. But in 1821, when Mexico is breaking away from Spain, there's a Spanish colonel, but he's born in Mexico, so he's a Creole. And he comes up with the answer for independence. Instead of fighting each other, we're all Mexicans. It doesn't matter what ethnicity or what your social class, we're all Mexicans. We need to band together. And that was Agustin Iturbide. And out of that, you get the Plan de Iguala, which is a plan to say, this is how we're going to set up a new government. And part of it was, we're going to protect the Catholic religion, we're going to be independent, and we're going to have equality among all levels of society. But one of the odd things is, this is an age when monarchies are being challenged, and you're having the republics like the United States and the French Republic. And so what are you going to replace? If you get rid of the Spanish, what are you going to put in their place? And their idea was, we'll keep a monarchy, but we'll get a European noble to come live in Mexico and be the king of Mexico. So this is the monarchist faction in Mexico. And that movement lasts for about a year and a half. And then that's when Mexico shifts to republicanism, and you get the Constitution of 1824.
Before we go any farther, I just want to make sure we're not confusing Cinco de Mayo with Mexican Independence Day. That is September 16th, 1810, kicking off the decade-long Mexican War of Independence against Spain.
Yes, Cinco de Mayo and the 16th of September, they're related, but they're not the same thing. They're not both Mexican Independence Days.
And what you are talking about does have to do with the Mexican War of Independence against Spain.
Yes. The 1821 Plan de Iguala essentially has a way to end the 1810 revolution. We're all Mexicans. Let's be one happy nation.
But that kumbaya moment does not last a long time.
Well, one of the things that I often find when I speak to people about Mexican history is that it's confusing. It seems like it's one revolution after another. It's kind of trite to say, well, that's what it is. But you have to understand what the sides are fighting about. And it's really over control. Who's going to have power of the government? Is it going to be centralized, or is it going to be dispersed throughout the states? That argument continues for about 40 years.
So after independence, you start to see Mexico divide into these political factions you're describing. The monarchists who want a king like Spain, the centralists who want a strong national government, and the Federalists who want a government set up with individual states like the United States.
Yes, that's a good, accurate description of the different parties. Now they're going to change, and sometimes they'll cooperate, and sometimes they're at philosophical war, and sometimes physical war with one another. But that's what happens. For example, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is very interesting because he starts off as a person who supports the Republican form of government. He's a Federalist. But in the mid-1830s, he changes sides and becomes a centralist. So you're allowed in Mexican politics to change sides.
And as we know, that whole idea of changing sides in the debate between centralists and federalists eventually led to our story here at the Alamo and the Texas Revolution.
Yes, exactly. Again, all history is connected. Texas history and Mexican history, they're related. And so if you know, I don't want to say if you know both sides, but if you know the complete story, it makes things make sense that otherwise seem like random happenings.
After Texas gained its independence, the fighting between Centralists and Federalists in Mexico did not end. But these teams, they changed names, if you will.
What happens to set up for the Texas Revolution is you get a centralist republic under Santa Anna. And that centralist republic lasts through the 1840s, but by the 1850s, certainly the mid-1850s, you have people like Santa Anna who begin to fade out of politics and others like him, and you have a new crop of politicians that come to the fore in Mexico. For example, Benito Juarez. The labels change, not necessarily their positions on government, but the labels change. The centralists become conservatives, and the federalists become liberals.
Does that have anything to do with the liberal and conservative titles that we use today?
Yeah, they're still kind of descriptive of what liberals at that time wanting to use government for the good of the people, and conservatives, wanting to preserve things. One of the big contentions was over the role of religion. Mexico had a state religion, Catholicism, and coming out of the French Revolution, the idea of we need to get rid of the control of religion. And so there's an anti-cleric component to the French Revolution that becomes part of Mexican liberalism, that church has too much power because it controls everyday life. And moreover, the church controlled so much land and property that from a liberal point, how can normal people acquire property if it's all owned by the church in large estates? And so part of it is class.
This time period in Mexico is often called the Federalist Wars.
That's one term I use and other historians have used to sort of tie all these events together in Mexico instead of going, well, this happened and then this happened, but it's one continuum of this event begat this event.
Because it was
biblical.
decades, as you said, of verbal clashes and physical skirmishes.
Yes.
This back and forth goes on for about 25 years after Texas independence. Something happens that sets the stage for Cinco de Mayo.
In 1857, the liberals had passed a new liberal constitution that diminished the power of the army, the church, the old bulwarks of the centralists. And so there's a big reaction to it. And there's actually a war called the War of the Reform, or the Reform War. And it brought Benito Juarez to the presidency of Mexico, and the liberals eventually win. But they had to borrow money in order to do that from England, from Spain, from France. And by 1861, Mexico, under Juarez, says, we have to halt payments. We just don't have the money to pay you right now. And so those three countries, England, France, and Spain, join together, and they essentially send an expedition to Mexico, very much like in the Pastry War of 1838, when the French had come to the port of Veracruz to collect money. Now in 1861, they're coming to collect money. And the United States, which has in place the Monroe Doctrine, no European influence, they're not able to actually act on that because 1861, they have their own problems. American Civil War is starting. And so the English and the Spanish realize, we're not going to get any money out of them. We're pulling out of this. We'll have another arrangement at some point. But the French, their leader is Napoleon III. And Napoleon III wants to have a bigger impact on the world stage. And so the idea of the monarchist, that idea of having a Mexican monarchy never went away. It just sort of was kept underground.
And at this point, they stage a political comeback.
At this point, there's a chance for a political comeback that the monarchists in Mexico are able to work with Napoleon III. They're eventually going to bring an Austrian archduke named Maximilian to Mexico, and the French and the Austrians will use the military to place him on the throne of Mexico. So you'll have the first Mexican empire under Iturbide, but the second one, backed by France and Austria, will be Maximilian. So how does the Battle of Puebla fit into all this?
Yeah, this brings us to May 5th, 1862, Cinco de Mayo. What happens?
If you were a betting person back then, you would have thought that the French, because of their military, this is the French, Napoleon's nephew, they were victorious in the Crimean War. They'd been fighting wars in Algiers, that they were experienced. They had a well-established military machine, and that they would be able to march into Mexico and march all the way to Mexico City. Because under the liberals, Juarez, you had scattered bands of rebels really pulling together an army instead of while facing an army that was an army. Puebla is on the road to Mexico City. And so as a French army is marching to Mexico City, General Ignacio Zaragoza and Porfirio Diaz, two Mexican generals, are able to pull together their scattered forces, and they defeat the French. And this is the Battle of Puebla. And it's kind of like remember the Alamo moment, San Jacinto moment, that becomes a battle cry, the Battle of Puebla, where what it means is we, the underdog, prevailed.
And that is Cinco de Mayo, the Battle of Puebla.
It becomes Cinco de Mayo. And Juarez thought it was so important that within a year, he declares it a Mexican holiday.
And there is a Texas connection in this battle. What is that?
The connection with Battle of Puebla is in the person of Ignacio Zaragoza. There's some question, is he related to the Seguins, the Erasmo Seguin?
We know
Juan
he was
Seguin?
born in Goliad.
Born in Goliad. And so, there may be a Texas connection there as well. But he's born in Goliad. He's the son of a presidial captain at Goliad, Presidio La Bahia. And in 1834, his family moves to Matamoros. So they're not in Texas at the time of the Texas Revolution. So he's raised in Mexico much of his life. But again, he's a Tejano. They claim him in Mexico as a Mexican, but Texans can claim him as a Tejano hero as well.
Even though Cinco de Mayo was a victory for Mexico, it's just not where this particular story ends. It keeps going.
Well, the idea of all history is connected. There's beginnings and then there's ends, and every end becomes a new beginning. But Maximilian is ultimately going to be executed. He will face the same fate that the first emperor did, Iturbide. They're both killed by firing squad. But it's because the French who've been backing him in Mexico see it as a losing proposition, and so they withdraw their support. And so with the European support gone, the Mexican liberals are able to win, and that's when you get Benito Juarez elected again president, really the start of the modern era of Mexico. But his successor is going to be his fellow general at Battle of Puebla, will be Porfirio Diaz, who's going to last as president up until the beginning of the next revolution in Mexico, the 1910 revolution. So it's all connected.
So why is Cinco de Mayo remembered, not just in Mexico, but around the world?
Cinco de Mayo becomes an object lesson. It's the story of the underdog prevailing against overwhelming odds. But for Mexico, it's become, and for Mexican Americans in particular, it's become a sense of pride in Mexican heritage, in Mexican history. That's why it continues to resonate instead of just sort of fading away.
It represents the fight for the right of a people to self-rule without outside interference.
Yes, it does. And, essentially, this is the fight for, it's not the War of Independence, but it will determine whether Mexico has an independent identity in the future.
So can we be so bold as to compare Cinco de Mayo to the Battle of the Alamo?
I'll have to think about that for a moment. But, Mexico, they win the battle here in the Alamo. Texans don't win. But again, the idea of a battle causing the population to care, to turn out, to garner support for the cause, they're very similar in that
The fight of the underdog.
fight of the underdog, and we will prevail.
Dr. Bruce Winters, thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We've linked to an essay Dr. Winters wrote on the Mexican War of Independence, which we discussed earlier in the episode. We've also linked to an essay the Alamo senior historian Ernesto Rodriguez wrote about Cinco de Mayo. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.